Nuts and Bolts, the unique encyclopedia of all home maintenance. Can you afford to be without it?
Of course, it's not finished yet, obviously.
Oh, no.
Unfortunately, I won't be able to repair it until August the 21st next year. Plastering and brickwork doesn't appear till issue 67.
Just one more commercial, and Godfrey's Utopia is now in sight.
You know there are certain combinations of those things that can be quite dangerous, don't you?
Thursday, 10:15 on BBC One.
Muriel?
This month on Crime Watch UK, we need your help to find whoever killed family man John Reynolds. He was gunned down a few yards from his home. Who was the motorcyclist seen close by? And in Shropshire, the hijack of a security van. Perhaps you can help. That's Crime Watch UK on Thursday at 9:30 on BBC One. We'll be waiting for your call.
In half an hour tonight on BBC One, Panorama reports on the recent increase in the number of racially motivated attacks in the UK. That's after the main evening news from the BBC with Martin Lewis.
Major changes in the divorce laws aim to reduce conflict between couples and cut costs. Partners who agree to break up will have to wait 1 year and be expected to seek mediation before going to court. A former Lord Chief Justice condemns automatic life sentences for murder and says judges should decide the punishment. European and American negotiators agree a deal on farm subsidies, but the French block it. Good evening. The government is planning to reform the divorce laws to try to reduce conflict between couples, cut the costs of a breakup and help save some marriages. The sole ground for divorce would be the irretrievable breakdown of a marriage, but this would have to be proved by waiting a full year. During that time, most couples would go to see a mediator who would try to save the marriage, and if that proved impossible, agree a settlement. They wouldn't have to see a mediator, but if they refused, they could lose legal aid. But it will mean longer delays for most divorces which involve adultery. The government says today's Green Paper reflects their commitment to family values.
Married today, but over a third of all marriages are destined to end in divorce. Britain has the highest divorce rate in Europe, though other countries are also seeing a sharp rise. The present British law encourages couples to fight in court, each with their own solicitors. In England and Wales, it costs £180 million in legal aid bills and causes such bitterness that half of all fathers have lost touch with their children by the time the case reaches the courts. Today's Green Paper strongly urges mediation instead of adversarial courtroom warfare. This separating couple weren't speaking to each other 2 months ago, but going through mediation led to amicable agreement.
We were very suspicious about each other's motivations, suspicious about what each other really meant, the hidden agendas and everything else, and was taking sort of action accordingly. When we actually sat down with John Akers, the mediator, we actually found that our aims in terms of what we wanted were very similar.
The Lord Chancellor said all divorcing couples would have to attend an information service to choose between marriage guidance, mediation and the law. Then they'd be directed towards the appropriate channel, with strong emphasis on mediation, which costs only a third of the price of a courtroom battle.
Mediation seems to offer scope for couples to sort out the practical problems without the need for so much expensive professional assistance.
Under the new proposals, couples could risk losing legal aid altogether if they unreasonably refuse to accept mediation. But any compulsion worries professional mediators.
The essential part of mediation is that people take part voluntarily and are making their own decisions and should feel free to enter it and free to make the decisions that they jointly arrive at. I would be very worried that any financial constraints could prevent that freedom in some way.
The paper proposes no-fault divorce for all. Currently, 3/4 of all couples divorce on grounds of adultery or unreasonable behaviour as a way of getting a quick divorce in under 6 months. Now they'd have to wait a year. Some cabinet ministers and Tory backbenchers have urged a tougher divorce law and want a 2-year cooling-off period.
What we don't want to have is people divorcing in haste and repenting at leisure. And there is some evidence that people who get divorced subsequently regret it.
Moralists in the government fear that this will look like a liberal reform, making divorce easier, They believe the state could halt the tide of divorce by delaying it for 2 years. But most of the professionals say delay in sorting out the debris leads to worse bitterness and destructive fighting over children. The consultation period is likely to be lively and noisy. Polly Toynbee, BBC News, Westminster.
The financial difficulties faced by parents when relationships break down have been examined by a committee of MPs looking into the new child support agency. The agency sets maintenance payments for absent parents. The Social Security Committee recommended that increased payments should be phased in over a maximum period of 2 years. Absent parents on low incomes should have more of their earnings protected, and the cost of caring for stepchildren should be taken into account.
In recent weeks, the Child Support Agency has been the target of mounting criticism, mostly by absent fathers and their second families. Today's report goes some way to answering concerns that they're being crippled financially. But one major bone of contention remains clean break divorce settlements. 2 years ago, Mike Pimlott, a computer analyst from Southampton, signed over his stake in the marital home in return for reduced maintenance. But the Child Support Agency takes no account of such court settlements and has more than doubled his weekly payments to £63.
To find that we're actually paying twice for maintenance is totally wrong. Now, clearly, a clean break order should mean just that, a clean break, and that is full and final, and it should not be resurrected under any guise whatsoever.
The Social Security Committee said the Child Support Agency was bringing about the most far-reaching social reforms for 40 years. There was no sensible way the agency could take into account clean break property settlements when reassessing maintenance.
The Child Support Agency does not have the skill to estimate what the value of a property settlement is now, when that was made many years ago, when property prices have fluctuated since.
The government is facing strong pressure from its own backbenchers to ease the burden on some absent parents now facing higher bills.
The bulk of the recommendations contained in the report are on the side of those who are paying. Behind all this also there are parents with care of children, 96% of whom are on benefit, and I have to take into account the amount of maintenance that they will be receiving as well. So there is two sides to this.
If the committee's recommendations are implemented, they should lessen the impact of higher maintenance costs on absent parents and their second families. But the issue of clean break divorce settlements will continue to be a major focus of complaint and ultimately legal action in the courts. Fergus Walsh, BBC News, Westminster.
The former Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lane, says murderers should not automatically be sentenced to life imprisonment. Lord Lane chaired a committee which recommends that life should remain the maximum sentence, but judges should be free to impose whatever penalty they see fit.
People convicted of murder are sentenced to life, whatever the circumstances, whether they're so-called mercy killers, battered wives, or terrorists and armed robbers. Although judges recommend a minimum term, Home Office ministers make the final decision over release. Lord Lane and his committee believe that's wrong.
It is no part of a politician's duty, whether he's a minister or not, to pass sentence upon people who've been convicted of crime.
They describe it as alarming that politicians have added public opinion to the criteria when deciding on early release.
When public opinion is called upon, so to speak, in these circumstances, usually means either I'm going to get more votes if I do this, or else it's an easy way of sanitizing his own views.
But after reviewing the system earlier this year, the present incumbent, Michael Howard, says the Home Secretary, democratically elected and accountable to Parliament, should have a role.
It's very important when we look at this unique offence that public feeling on these issues should be taken into account. We are talking, after all, about an offence that, until comparatively recently, was subject to the death penalty. It is a separate offence, a unique offence, the deliberate taking of someone's life.
There's wide agreement that victims' families would benefit from knowing how long a convicted person was actually going to be in prison. The Howden's daughter, Tessa, was murdered 7 years ago. Her killer is serving life.
I think it would have been much better if the judge had announced how long he was expected to serve. It would have been far better for us. I'm not so bothered, obviously, about the perpetrator, but it would have certainly been better for us, and we could have geared our lives accordingly.
Eric Oldham served 23 years as a life prisoner. He agrees with the report that a fixed term, however long, is better than the present indeterminate sentence.
It doesn't give a man any hope. He just goes through the time. It's like a time warp. There's no set goal. He can't plan anything.
The committee emphasised that changing the law would not mean softer sentences, but would mean a punishment that can be seen to fit the crime. Neil Bennett, BBC News, Westminster.
Nationalist politicians have said last night's murder of 2 Catholics in North Belfast was an attempt to undermine the Anglo-Irish peace initiative. The outlawed Ulster freedom fighters say they shot dead a 15-year-old boy and a taxi driver.
The victims were selected at random. 15-year-old Brian Duffy had just got into a taxi in the Ligoneel Road in West Belfast. The car's headlights were on, the driver about to set off, when another car drew up alongside. It's thought 4 shots were fired. The teenager's father, who's also a taxi driver, was in the firm's office a couple of yards away. His son died instantly. The driver, 31-year-old John Todd, died later in hospital. Both were Catholics. At Brian Duffy's school, prayers were said for him at a special assembly. He was described as a typical teenager, concentrating on next year's GCSE exams.
I think it's really a feeling of that Brian Duffy shouldn't be dead. Brian Duffy is a 15-year-old boy at the start of his life, that it's in a way unnatural for a boy of 15 to be dead.
Within an hour of the attack, the outlawed loyalist group, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, said they had done it. Today, all political parties here condemned the murders. The randomness and the viciousness of the attack emphasise the need for peace, but at the same time undermine the hope that is needed for any peace process.
It's not that it would put hope out of the people, but it has taken a bit of the steam out of their hopes for peace, which was very strong in the last few weeks, very strong.
For the peace process has to overcome the fear on the streets engendered by a car full of shotgun-toting men ending the lives of a taxi driver and a schoolboy. Kate Adey, BBC News, Belfast.
Granada Television, which owns the ITV franchise for the northwest of England, has made a £600 million takeover bid for London Weekend Television. It's the second proposed merger since the Heritage Secretary, Peter Brook, said he was relaxing the takeover rules among ITV companies. London Weekend Television has advised its shareholders to reject the bid. Our media correspondent Nick Hyam reports.
Granada's the oldest ITV company, and in Coronation Street it produces the network's perennial ratings blockbuster, with audiences of 18 million or more. It's not just Coronation Street that pulls the crowds. Granada's selling more programmes than ever to ITV. But the television company is just part of a much larger business empire, including motorway service stations, television rental shops and a catering business. LWT, maker of Blind Date and London's Burning, is barely a quarter the size of Granada, but it's desperate to remain independent. It's widely thought to be planning a bit of its own for Emmerdale producer Yorkshire Tyne Teas, if it can find someone to buy Tyne Teas. LWT managers like Chief Executive Greg Dyke, millionaires thanks to a controversial share option scheme, are recommending shareholders not to accept Granada's offer, saying LWT's own programmes, profits and management are all strong.
This is a company with a great future. We can understand why Granada needs LWT. It's far less clear that LWT needs Granada.
But at a news conference this morning, Granada claimed LWT was too small to compete in the fast-expanding high-tech world of television.
We believe that, in its own right, one small franchise within ITV, however well that's run, is going to be marginalised in this huge play that is now going on in the television industry. And really, that's the reason why we would strongly recommend, obviously, LWT to accept the offer.
Job losses are likely, but Granada insists it wants to keep both its own Manchester studios and LWT's in London to create a programme-making company second to none.
MPs still have to approve a change in the rules to allow 2 large ITV companies to merge. Labour says it'll vote against the change when it's debated on Wednesday, worried that in the long run, fewer ITV programmes will be made outside London. Nick Hyam, BBC News.
European and American negotiators have reached agreement in principle on cutting farming subsidies in the GATT World Trade talks in Brussels. But shortly after the agreement, the French said the deal was unacceptable. The French Foreign Minister is meeting Europe's trade representative, Sir Leon Brittan, now to try and find a solution. The deadline for a GATT deal to open up world trade is 15th of December.
Behind the smiles, the atmosphere was distinctly edgy as the negotiations resumed at the start of what's generally agreed will be a crucial week for a GATT agreement. Europe's Farm Commissioner and his American counterpart quickly agreed in principle on a compromise over agriculture. But this can't go through until Sir Leon Brittan and Mickey Cantor reach agreement on the other trade questions still dividing them. Tonight, they're still talking.
Long, arduous and tough negotiations. Very workmanlike atmosphere, but it's taking a while, and it's impossible to say at this time exactly how long it's going to take and when we can go to explain things to the ministers.
In fact, the ministers had gathered this morning hoping to hear the outcome. All knew the urgency of reaching agreement.
Well, these are last-minute negotiations, last-minute bargaining. I suppose that's inevitable in a negotiation of this kind, as long as everybody realizes that this time the clock is ticking seriously.
With the talks moving slowly, ministers were told to come back again in the morning. But within the past hour, the French Minister Alain Juppé has turned up for face-to-face talks with Sir Leon Brittan. Earlier, he described the farm proposals as unacceptable. Sir Leon Brittan and Mickey Cantor had hoped to be on a plane to Geneva tonight to start concluding negotiations with the world's other trading nations. But those talks remain largely academic until Europe and America finalise their deal. Graham Leach, BBC News, Brussels.
The BBC has learned details of the rescue package being offered to investors in Lloyd's of London who've been ruined by recent losses. The settlement, which will be made public tomorrow, is aimed at halting legal action against the insurance market. But angry investors say it won't be enough.
Late into the night, work is continuing on the rescue scheme designed to provide a lifeline for both Lloyd's ruined investors and for the insurance market itself. Lloyd's is facing a wave of litigation from investors threatening negligence and fraud following recent calamitous losses. Tomorrow, its ruling council will offer the rebels a deal, help with their debts if they call off the lawyers. Few details of the offer have leaked out until tonight. Lloyd's losses in the past 3 years total £6 billion. The rescue package will amount to £900 million. There are around 230 underwriting syndicates at Lloyd's, but the aid will be concentrated in just 6, which have suffered the biggest losses and have the strongest legal case. A few of the biggest losers will be offered up to 45% of what they've lost. Those with a poor legal case will be offered nothing. First indications are that this offer won't be enough to defuse the litigation. Leading figures among the rebel names point out that compensation will apply only to the past, whilst huge losses still lie ahead. They believe they'll get more by pressing on with legal action. If this deal does fail, the battle through the courts could prove a battle to the death for Lloyd's of London. Peter Morgan, BBC News in the City.
President Clinton has described North Korea's offer to allow inspectors to visit some of their nuclear sites as not entirely discouraging. But the International Atomic Energy Agency called the offer inadequate. America has already said it's determined that North Korea should not be allowed to build nuclear weapons. Most foreigners are banned from entering North Korea, but our correspondent, Humphrey Hawksley, managed to get in. He reports now from the capital, Pyongyang.
The world's last entrenched Stalinist state prepares for war. An air raid practice in the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. The city empties in minutes. Loudspeakers blare out that American missiles could hit at any time. This is the latest global flashpoint. It's isolated, secretive. Only a few foreigners are allowed in. The people are oppressed. The society is inward-looking. The underground stations are called Glory, Rehabilitation, Victory. The people are told where to live, where to work, what to eat and how to think, and how to spy on their families. This country is instilled with the idea that the successful socialist revolution is under threat from the imperialist United States, that Washington wants to start another war, and that the only man who can save North Korea is the great leader Kim Il-sung. The society is the creation of this one man. At 81, he's frail but in control. A model of his patronage is the Pyongyang Maternity Hospital. visitors aren't allowed in. Fathers can only see and speak to mother and baby on a telephone video. It's 10 days before they can be with them. There are 1,500 beds, and we're told exactly 1,500 patients. That's how North Korea works. There's unlikely to be a people's power revolution here, as in Europe. The indoctrination is too thorough, the nationalism, the loyalty to the great leader too obsessive. In his campaign to bring North Korea into line, Bill Clinton is taking on the last Stalinist dictator. Kim Il-sung says he wants unification with South Korea by 1995. America believes he's trying to build a nuclear bomb to achieve it. Humphrey Hawksley, BBC News, Pyongyang in North Korea.
A former fitter in a Royal Naval dockyard who contracted leukemia working on nuclear submarines has been awarded £167,000 in damages against the Ministry of Defence. Rudy Molinari, who's 39, developed the disease after exposure to radiation as he carried out essential repair work on the submarines at the Royal Naval Dockyard at Chatham in Kent. The ministry admitted liability but denied negligence. Russia goes to the polls on Sunday in the first general election since the fall of communism. The result will determine the pace of economic reform in a country which has seen a dramatic decline in living standards since state subsidies on basic commodities were lifted. The parties are divided between supporters and opponents of economic reform. 13 parties are fielding candidates. The biggest reforming party is Russia's Choice, led by the Deputy Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar. The Yabloko bloc, led by Grigory Yavlinsky, features a slower pace of reform. The Movement for Democratic Reform wants protection for low-income groups. It's led by Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg. The main party against reform is the Communist Party. Its leader, Gennady Zyuganov, wants to return to a command economy.
St. Petersburg, city of the Tsars, cradle of the revolution, and today at the forefront of Boris Yeltsin's free market reforms. Some here, a fortunate few, are now living a lifestyle unthinkable under communism. Others, though, have been plunged into poverty, unemployment and despair. Mr. Yeltsin's critics say he's looking after society's winners, but not its losers. A privately run soup kitchen in St. Petersburg provides food for the destitute and homeless. Opposition parties fighting this weekend's election here say this is the human cost of President Yeltsin's policies. This pensioner told me she scavenges meat from rubbish tips. Market economics, she says, have brought nothing but hunger.
I've lost half my body weight. I used to weigh more than 100 kilograms, and now I'm only 48. How has it happened that life here has become so dreadful? I'm 63, but I'm praying to God that I die soon, so I won't have to suffer this torture anymore.
Some of the young in St. Petersburg are so desperate they've turned to prostitution. Women who were students, teachers and nurses, for example, say chronic inflation under Mr. Yeltsin has wiped out their savings and salaries, so now they have to sell their bodies to curb crawlers. For most people in this city, life is a daily struggle. Here we found shoppers queuing for bread that was unusually cheap and squabbling about it. Mr. Yeltsin has put more food into the shops, but without subsidies it's far more expensive, and voters here are deeply disillusioned. Opinion polls have shown that little more than half the electorate here in St. Petersburg will bother to vote this weekend. It may be the first election since the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's also one that many Russians are past caring about. Ben Brown, BBC News, St. Petersburg.
The official solicitor, Peter Harris, has ordered the businessman Peter Malkin to return his 12-year-old son to his mother. Mr. Malkin breached a custody order when he abducted Oliver from his former wife's home in Brittany last month. Father and son were traced to the Red Sea resort of Hurghada after evading police throughout Europe. Mr. Harris has said Mr. Malkin is in contempt of court and is considering sending a representative to Egypt. The former head of East Germany's spy network during the Cold War has been sentenced to 6 years in jail for treason and bribery. Markus Wolf, whose spies penetrated to the heart of the West German government, has lodged an appeal. Today he said he had only been doing his duty according to the laws of East Germany. The Princess of Wales today made one of her last public appearances before the drastic reduction in her engagements she announced last Friday comes into effect. This morning she attended a long-planned aircraft naming ceremony at Heathrow Airport.
It turned out to be a bizarre event starring a princess, a tycoon and eventually a pop star. The setting was an airport hangar, the occasion the naming of Richard Branson's new Airbus. It should have been a routine royal engagement, but Friday's announcement has guaranteed that the handful of appearances left before the princess retreats from the limelight will attract avid press interest. Perched somewhat precariously on a hydraulic platform, she seemed relatively at ease, though pensive at times, and came close to a fit of the giggles when Mr. Branson's microphone spluttered to a halt. He paid tribute to her charity work and hoped her retreat from public life would not last too long.
I would not want to speed up your life, but would like to make one wish today, that your children grow up healthily and quickly so that your good works can continue again soon.
It was a remark that left her looking uncomfortable. But with an encouraging and surprisingly informal helping hand from her host, she unveiled the Airbus's name and immediately found herself being serenaded from across the hangar by Chris de Burgh with a song that's said to be one of her favourites.
Never seen you shine so bright.
There followed scenes reminiscent of a Grand Prix victory, adding to the impression that the whole event had more to do with show business than royalty. Jenny Bond, BBC News, Heathrow.
Astronauts on the Space Shuttle Endeavour have successfully completed their most spectacular task so far in repairing the Hubble telescope. They removed the telescope's solar panels and put new ones in their place. One of the old panels was too badly damaged to be rolled up, so it was dumped in space.
This morning, astronauts Kathy Thornton and Tom Ackers tackled one of the mission's key goals, replacing the solar arrays, which between them generate nearly 5 kilowatts of electrical power. They'd planned to bring both the old solar arrays back to Earth, but the one with the bent strut refused to roll up, and NASA decided it had to be ditched. With Kathy Thornton on the end of the robot arm, they unbolted the array and unhooked its electrical connectors. They worked at night, in the dark. If they'd done it in sunlight, with the panels working, the astronauts might have got an electric shock. Once free, Kathy Thornton held it aloft, waiting for the order to let it go.
KT jettison time is sunrise, so you're going to be hanging on to it all through the night.
Once they were in daylight, the panel was released.
You ready? Yeah, I'm ready. Okay, they say you got to go for release. Hey, no hands.
The shuttle backed away as the panel floated off. With both solar arrays removed, the astronauts set about fixing the new ones in place. They'll be unfurled on Thursday, but initial tests show they're working well. With today's work completed successfully, NASA is keeping its fingers crossed for tomorrow's spacewalk, when the astronauts will begin to ensure the telescope can focus properly. The discarded panel will remain in orbit about a year before burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. James Wilkinson, BBC News.
And the main news again. The government is proposing major changes in the divorce laws. A married couple would have to wait 1 year and be expected to seek mediation before going to court. The aim is to reduce conflict and cut costs. Newsnight is on BBC Two at 10:30 as usual. That is the 9 o'clock news tonight. Good night.
This is BBC One Southwest.
Good evening. The former head of a Plymouth primary school has been charged with 4 offences relating to financial mismanagement. Caris Edwards reports.
Jeff Burley was suspended in September after an audit revealed the school's budget was overspent by £180,000. Mr. Burley later resigned, the day before he'd been due to face a disciplinary hearing. Today, Devon and Cornwall Police announced that he'd been interviewed and charged with 4 offences, 3 of theft and another under the Forgery and Counterfeiting Act of 1981. Mr. Burley will appear in court in January. Meanwhile, school governors are meeting tonight to try to get their finances back on an even keel. It's feared their action plan could result in job losses.
A Devon businessman is facing legal moves to force him to give up his 12-year-old son, whom he kidnapped in France last month. Peter Malkin is holding his son Oliver at a hotel in Egypt.
Oliver Malkin was snatched near his mother's home in Brittany 4 weeks ago. Father and son have now been traced to the Red Sea resort of Hurghada. Mr. Malkin, who's abducted Oliver twice before, says he now wants to return to England with his son.
If the courts that are handling it are interested in Oliver's future and Oliver's interests, they should come up with some answer.
Peter Malkin's assets, including the Churston Court Hotel near Brixham, have been frozen. The official solicitor is trying to get Oliver to Paris to reunite him with his mother.
Tomorrow's weather prospects becoming brighter as any early cloud and rain clears away south. A scattering of showers then developing, which will become widespread during the second half of the afternoon as rain and thicker cloud moves in from the west after dusk.
Hello, very good evening to you. Well, we're all in for a spell of wet and at times very windy weather over the coming few days. The reason is all these clouds coming in from the North Atlantic, one weather system after another snaking its way across into the British Isles. That's going to bring the rains and some strong winds as we go through the week. First, the rains now coming in the most western and the northern side, working their way southwards as we go through this evening. Some heavier rain, and they're shown by those brighter colours. I think the rainfall going to continue to work its way southwards and eastwards as we go through the night, followed by some wintry showers into the north, falling as sleet and snow over the higher ground. Not a particularly cold night in the south, but further north under those clearer skies, temperatures may fall low enough to bring a touch of frost and some icy patches by the morning. So tomorrow we have the cold front just pushing its way over into the continent. That's going to affect the far southeast to start the day, so windy and dull and wet at first in the most southern and eastern part of England, but then brightening up as the morning wears on. For many northern eastern areas, well, a bright start. For the north and west, lots of showers around. Those showers becoming heavier, becoming more widespread as we go into the afternoon. Some pushing over into the northeast, some pushing further south over North and West Wales. I think a few getting through there into the more central parts, into the Midlands, for example. A colder day, though, everywhere, and a windy day as well. Best temperatures around 6 to 8 degrees. It's going to get even windier as we go through then into Wednesday. This area of low pressure deepening, moving rapidly into the British Isles and then across the British Isles as we go through Wednesday and into Thursday. That's going to bring some heavier rain, but not a bad start today, I think, for most of the country on Wednesday. Fairly bright and mostly dry in many central and eastern areas. A bit of a chilly start, though, and some wintry showers continuing to affect the most northern parts of Scotland. As we go into the afternoon to the middle of the part of the day, this cloud is going to thicken up from the south and west, bring that rain quickly across all parts of the country, and it will be very heavy in many central and southern parts of England. And those gales are going to affect central and southern parts of England as well. Brighter weather with showers will follow later. That's it. Good night.
As you know, our embassy in Beirut was the target this morning of a vicious terrorist bombing.
In 1983, Islamic fundamentalism challenged the most powerful nation on earth.
Our policy will be one of swift and effective retribution.
Let's hurt the people who make these decisions.
The Pentagon instructed an undercover agent to devise that retribution.
We had names, we had locations.
Who were those people you were looking for?
Sheikh Fadlallah, the spiritual leader of Hezbollah, and he still is.
Frightening facts about the war that Reagan lost. States of Terror, Wednesday at 9:30 on BBC One.